I knew something was wrong the moment my son stood up and walked away from the table. Not because he left, people leave tables all the time, but because the silence he left behind didn't behave normally. It didn't settle. It hovered. The kind of silence that listens, the kind that waits to see who will speak first and who will survive it. We were already in Dubai, seated in a quiet corner of the hotel dining space where everything looked expensive enough to hide bad behavior. Soft lights, low music, plates arranged like nobody here was supposed to feel uncomfortable. My son excused himself to take a call, phone already to his ear, eyes focused somewhere far beyond me. The second he disappeared from sight, I felt it. The air shifting, thinning, like the room had decided to test me. Yvette didn't speak right away. She watched, not casually, not politely. She watched me eat. Her eyes followed my hand, my fork, the way I leaned forward. Every movement felt examined, measured against a rule book I didn't know existed. When I reached for my bread, she made a small sound under her breath. Not loud enough to attract attention, just enough to register as disapproval. "Not like that," she said softly. Before I could respond, her fingers closed around my wrist. Light pressure, directional, guiding my hand like I'd failed a test. It wasn't painful. That wasn't the point. The point was permission. Hers, not mine. I pulled my hand back slowly and set my napkin on the table. Careful, deliberate. "Please don't touch me," I said, keeping my voice even. One sentence, calm, clean. Her smile didn't disappear. It changed. "We're in a different place," she replied quietly. "People notice things here." Her eyes flicked around the room, then back to me. "I'm trying to help you." Help. That word pressed down on my chest like weight. I looked at her fully then, not angry, just present. "I'm eating," I said. "That's all." She didn't answer right away. She checked the distance to where my son had gone. She checked the room. She checked me. And in that brief assessment, I understood something that made my stomach go cold. Whatever happened next had already been decided. The slap landed fast. One sharp crack against my cheek, precise and controlled, delivered across the small space between us like she knew exactly how much force to use. Enough to hurt, not enough to draw eyes. My vision sparked at the edges, heat blooming under my skin in a way that felt exposed and private at the same time. I didn't move. I didn't gasp. I didn't reach for my face. I kept my hands flat on the table because instinct told me something important. If I reacted wrong, I wouldn't just be hit. I would be blamed. Around us, nothing stopped. A server walked past. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed softly at another table. That was how she planned it. Quiet violence blends in better. Yvette froze for half a second, then her body rearranged itself. Her shoulders drew inward. Her breathing shortened. Her eyes filled with tears that hadn't existed a moment earlier. She wasn't panicking. She was preparing. I stayed still, counting my breaths, letting the sting settle deep instead of wide. I'm Lone Mavers, and if you're listening to this right now, type the time and where you're watching from in the comments, because moments like this feel different depending on where you're standing when silence turns against you. My cheek throbbed, but I didn't touch it. Touching it would have looked like accusation. Silence, I realized, was safer. I heard my son's footsteps before I saw him. His voice carried toward us, mid-sentence from his call, then stopped abruptly. He stood there, eyes moving from Yvette's trembling hands to my unnaturally still posture. Confusion crossed his face first, then concern, then something else, something sharper, as he took in the scene without context. "What's going on?" he asked. And in that moment, with my face burning and Yvette already shaking beside me, I understood the real danger wasn't the slap. It was who he was about to believe. The moment my son asked what was going on, Yvette moved like she'd been waiting for her cue, not rushing, not frantic, just fast in the way practiced people are fast, already deciding where his eyes should land first. She stood up halfway, enough to look smaller, enough to look shaken, and she let out a breath that sounded like she'd been holding herself together for him. "Nathaniel," she said softly, like she was protecting him from the truth, and that one word did something I didn't like, because it pulled him toward her before he'd even looked at me properly. His gaze skimmed my face, then snapped back to hers, as if my pain was a detail and her trembling was the headline. "Loan," he started, but Yvette's hand went up, palm toward him in a gentle stop, a gesture that said she was overwhelmed, that she needed him to take control. She didn't point at me. She didn't accuse loudly. She chose the kind of language that makes a person feel like they're being reasonable for believing it. "I didn't want it to be like this," she said, eyes wet, voice low enough that the people nearby couldn't catch the words, only the mood. I tried to keep it respectful. Then she glanced at me, quick, sharp, almost daring, and looked away like I was too much to face. "Keep what respectful?" my son asked, and his tone wasn't angry yet, but I heard the shift in it, that protective edge he used to reserve for me when he was younger and the world felt unfair. Now it slid toward his wife like it belonged there. Yvette took a slow breath, and when she spoke again, she placed each word like she'd rehearsed them in her head, while I sat there still. "She grabbed me," she said, simple, clean. Not hard, but she grabbed my wrist, and she raised her voice at me. She rubbed her wrist like the skin needed comfort. There was no mark. There wouldn't be. That's why she chose it. "I asked her to please calm down," she continued, and I watched her create a version of me that wasn't me at all. An older woman out of control, humiliating her in public, forcing her hand. I told her we can talk later, privately. I didn't want a scene. That part was the most insulting, because she said it while standing in the middle of it, while my cheeks still burned, while my son's attention narrowed into a tunnel with her at the center. He looked from her eyes to her hand to her wrist, and the longer he looked, the more his face hardened into decision. "Mom," he said, voice quieter now, like he didn't want anyone else to hear me being corrected. "Did you touch her?" The word touch carried weight, like the truth was already leaning one way and I was being asked to climb uphill to reach it. I kept my voice steady because panic would gift her exactly what she needed. "I told her not to put her hands on me," I said. "That's all." My son's eyes flicked to Yvette again. She shook her head immediately, a tiny denial that came too quickly, too automatic, like her body had been trained to reject anything that threatened the story. "He saw her face," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the word face, like she couldn't bear it. "And that's why you're looking at me like I did something wrong." She stepped closer to him, just a fraction, closing the space between them the way married people do when they want to become one unit. "I swear I didn't want to hurt her," she said, and that swear was clever because it admitted nothing while sounding honest. But she came at me. I got scared. I reacted. My son exhaled hard through his nose, the way he does when he's trying to calm himself down and failing. He didn't ask me if I was okay. He didn't ask why her hand would reach my face. He didn't ask what happened while he was away. He focused on the part of her story that made him feel like a man who had to defend his wife, not a son who had to protect his mother. "Why would you do that here?" he said to me, and the disappointment in his voice landed heavier than the heat in my cheek. Because disappointment from your child is a kind of loneliness you can't explain to people who haven't lived it. I felt something inside me go quiet, an old instinct to plead, to explain, to soften him back toward me, and I pushed it down because I could see where this was headed. Yvette's eyes stayed on mine for one dangerous second, and behind the tears there was a steady satisfaction, like she'd gotten him exactly where she wanted him. My son's phone buzzed in his hand, and he looked at the screen without thinking, then looked up again as if the vibration reminded him he could do something immediate, something final. "We're not doing this," he said, more to the room than to me. and he turned his body slightly so his back shielded her from my view, a protective stance that made my stomach tighten. "I'm going to handle it." He stepped away from the table, phone already rising to his ear, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jump near his temple. And as he walked off toward the lobby side of the dining area, Yvette sat back down like the crisis had passed, like the only thing left was for his call to turn her lie into something official. By the time we reached Dubai Airport, my cheek had stopped burning and started throbbing in a slower, deeper way, like my body had decided to keep the memory under the skin. Nathaniel walked ahead of me with that tight, purposeful stride people use when they want the world to think they're in control, and Yvette stayed close to his side, quiet now, eyes forward, looking like a woman who'd survived something instead of caused it. I didn't ask where we were going or why we were rushing. I followed because mothers learn early that when you press a question too soon, you give people room to call you dramatic. The terminal air hit me cold and polished, the scent of coffee and perfume layered over that constant airport smell. Clean floors, tired bodies, and time. Nathaniel kept his phone in his hand like it was a tool, not a device, thumb moving in short, hard taps. We reached the check-in area, and he didn't look at me when he said, "Stay here." Not "Mom, stay here." Just stay here like I was luggage he needed to position. Yvette sat on a bench a few steps away, ankles crossed, hands folded, watching the flow of people with a calm that didn't match my pulse. I stood where he left me and watched my son approach the counter with the kind of confidence I used to be proud of, the kind that gets doors opened and questions answered. The staff member greeted him politely. Nathaniel leaned in, spoke low, and slid a passport across the counter. A few clicks on a keyboard, a pause. Then the staff member's expression changed. Not alarm, not concern, just that neutral look people get when they've seen this type of situation before and know their role is to enforce policy, not comfort feelings. Nathaniel's shoulders tightened. He gestured once with his hand, small and sharp like he was cutting a conversation shorter than it wanted to be. He turned and called my name finally, but it sounded like obligation. Loan. I walked toward him, and I felt Yvette's gaze follow me like a hand on the back of my neck. The staff member looked at my documents, then looked up at me with a calm face that didn't belong to my life. "Madam," she said, voice steady, "your booking has been canceled." I blinked once because I thought I'd misheard. Canceled sounded like weather, like something that happened to flights, not people. "Canceled?" I repeated, keeping my voice low, keeping it polite. "We're checking in now." The staff member turned the screen slightly, not so I could see everything, just enough to show me there was nothing there for me. "It was canceled earlier," she said, and then, without drama, without judgment, she added the sentence that split my day in half. "Your son requested it." The words hung between us like a sign somebody had just flipped. I looked at Nathaniel. He didn't meet my eyes immediately. His jaw worked once as if he was chewing something bitter. He glanced at Yvette, and I watched the smallest exchange happen without a single word. Her chin lifting a fraction, his shoulders stiffening, his mouth pressing into a line like he'd already committed to being the kind of man who stands with his wife, even when he knows the ground is wrong. "There must be a mistake," I said, because I needed him to correct it, to laugh lightly, to tell the woman behind the counter she had the wrong passenger. Nathaniel didn't laugh. He didn't correct anything. He turned back to the staff member and asked a question I couldn't hear, and the staff member answered quietly, eyes flicking between us as if she could already sense which one of us had power and which one of us had pain. She pointed to a policy sign, then typed something else, then shook her head with the kind of finality that doesn't care about family. Nathaniel's phone buzzed in his hand. He looked at it, and for a second his face did something human. Hesitation, guilt, a crack. He stared at the screen like it might give him a better option than what he'd already chosen. I saw his thumb hover over the call button and stop. That pause was the only proof I got that somewhere inside him, a part of my son knew this was cruel. He exhaled slowly, then put the phone to his ear and stepped away from the counter, turning his body so I couldn't read his mouth. Yvette rose from the bench and came closer, not to me, but to him. She stopped at his shoulder like a guardian, and her eyes met mine for a brief moment with a look that wasn't anger anymore. It was certainty. The staff member cleared her throat softly, bringing my attention back to the counter. "Would you like to rebook, madam?" she asked, as if rebooking were a simple choice, as if money wasn't an invisible wall. My voice stalled. I reached into my handbag on instinct, fingers searching for the weight of my phone, the familiar shape, the small rectangle that meant I could call someone, text someone, prove I existed outside this moment. My hand met nothing but fabric in the edge of my wallet. I searched again, slower, trying to be calm, trying to pretend this wasn't happening in layers. But my phone wasn't there. My throat tightened without permission. I looked up sharply, eyes scanning Nathaniel's back, then Yvette's composed face, then the counter, then my bag again, as my fingers kept digging, deeper and deeper, until my nails scraped the lining and the truth landed hard. I didn't have my phone. The first thing I did was stop moving, because panic makes you clumsy, and clumsy makes you look guilty, and I refused to give Yvette anything else she could fold into her story. I kept my hand inside my bag for one more second, fingers still against the empty lining where my phone should have been. Then I pulled my hand out slowly like I was withdrawing from a hot surface. The staff member behind the counter waited with the same neutral face, not unkind, just trained not to take sides. I lifted my eyes past the counter and found Nathaniel standing a few steps away with his phone pressed to his ear, shoulders stiff, head angled slightly, as if he didn't want the person on the line to hear whatever was happening here. Yvette stood close enough to touch him, not touching, just occupying the space where a mother might have stood if she still mattered. When Nathaniel finally turned back toward me, his face was set in that careful, blank expression men use when they've decided something and don't want to feel it. He didn't walk over. He didn't lower his voice and explain. He simply made a small gesture with his hand, 2 fingers flicking in the air like he was directing traffic, and said, "You'll be fine. Just wait there." It wasn't the words that hurt most. It was the fact that he said them like he believed them. Like being fine was a default setting for me. Like I'd always figured things out. Like that history could be used as an excuse to abandon me. I opened my mouth to speak and stopped, because I could hear how it would sound if I pleaded in a place full of strangers, an older woman begging her grown son not to leave her. Yvette's eyes stayed on my face, and I could see her measuring, waiting for me to crack so she could step back into her fragile role. Nathaniel glanced at her, then back at me, and for a moment I saw it. The hesitation again, the thin seam of guilt trying to split his decision open, his jaw flexed like he was swallowing something. Then Yvette leaned in and murmured something I couldn't hear, and whatever softness might have surfaced in him disappeared like a light turned off. He nodded once, as if agreeing to a plan they'd already formed without me. He turned his body away from me first, a subtle turn that signaled the end of our conversation before it ever started, and he took Yvette's carry-on by the handle. It was such a normal gesture, husband and wife moving through an airport, that for a second, my mind rebelled against what it meant. They were leaving, not stepping aside, not going to the restroom, leaving. My feet stayed planted, not because I was calm, but because the shame in me refused to allow my body to chase them. I watched them merge into the flow of travelers, Nathaniel's head tilted toward Yvette as she spoke softly, her face turned up like she was the one who needed comfort. He listened. He nodded again. They moved past a duty-free sign, past a cluster of people pulling suitcases, past a family taking pictures in front of a glowing advertisement, and nobody looked twice because nothing about them looked wrong. That's what betrayal likes. blending in. I turned back to the counter because my pride needed somewhere to rest, and I asked the staff member quietly, "He canceled it." I didn't make it a question. I made it a fact because facts are harder to argue with. The staff member's eyes flicked to her screen and back to me. "Yes, madam," she said. "The booking was canceled by the person who created it." Her tone stayed gentle, but it landed like a stamp. I nodded once because if I let my face change too much, the tears would come. And once tears come in public, people decide you're unstable. "Can I call him?" I asked, and then the absurdity hit me. "Call him with what?" The staff member paused. "Do you have another phone, madam?" she asked, and I almost laughed at how polite the world could be while it watched you drown. I told her, "No, just that. No, no phone, no ticket, no plan that included me." I stepped away from the counter so I wouldn't block the line, and the air around me felt suddenly too open, too wide, like the space was waiting to swallow me. I chose a seat near a pillar where I could see the check-in area and the departures board at the same time, because I needed something to anchor my eyes. I sat with my bag on my lap like it was a shield. My cheeks still throbbed in slow pulses, a private reminder that this day had started with a hand to my face and was now ending with my son's back. Announcements rolled overhead in a smooth voice that didn't care who understood it. Flight numbers and gate changes and boarding calls pouring out like water. People stood up when their names were called, gathered their things, kissed cheeks, checked passports, moved on. The world kept offering exits to everyone except me. I stared at the departures board until the letters blurred, then blinked them back into focus. And that was when I saw it. My flight number, bright and ordinary, shifting to boarding. And a second later, the overhead voice called it out, clear as day, like an invitation I no longer belonged to, and I stayed seated, hands tight around my bag, because I couldn't move even if I wanted to. I waited until the boarding notice disappeared from the screen before I stood up, because watching that word vanish felt like the world shutting a door in slow motion, and I needed my legs to remember they still belonged to me. My hands were steady when I lifted my bag, but my stomach wasn't. There was a hollow pull inside me that came from realizing I couldn't call anybody to confirm I wasn't imagining this. I walked back to the counter with measured steps, not hurried, not frantic, because the moment you sound desperate in a place like this, people start speaking to you like you're already a problem. The same staff member looked up as I approached again, and I saw the smallest shift in her eyes, recognition mixed with caution, as if she'd already decided what she could and couldn't do for me. "Madam," she said politely. I nodded, keeping my voice low. "I need to understand what options I have," I said, choosing words carefully, the way you do when you're speaking to someone who has rules for a living. My return ticket was canceled by the person who booked it. I don't have my phone. I'm here alone. I didn't add emotion. I didn't mention the slap. I didn't mention Yvette. Airports don't care about family wounds. They care about bookings, IDs, and procedures. And I was going to stay inside the language that could move the needle. She asked for my passport again. I handed it over. The plastic edge scraped my fingertips in a small, sharp way that made me aware of my own hands, older hands, hands that had held a child's fevered head and signed school forms and balanced bills, hands now hovering over a counter like they were asking permission to exist. She typed. The keyboard clicks were steady, indifferent. A second staff member leaned in, glanced at the screen, and whispered something I couldn't hear. The first staff member kept her face neutral. "The booking was canceled," she repeated, as if repetition could somehow soften it. "Yes," I said. "I heard you. I'm asking what can be done." She glanced up and her eyes were kind for a moment. Then she slid back behind policy. "We can look at rebooking options," she said. And I felt my throat tighten at the way she said options, plural, as if any of them would fit my reality. but the fare will be based on availability and current pricing. That was the first time money entered the conversation, and it entered quietly, like a warning. I reached into my bag and pulled out my wallet. I opened it slowly because I didn't want my hands to shake. I saw my cards lined up neatly the way I keep them, and I realized in that moment that even if I had access to everything in my wallet, it wouldn't fix the deeper issue. This wasn't just about buying a new ticket. It was about the fact that my son had decided I didn't deserve the one I already had. Still, I held the wallet in my hand and asked, "Can you tell me the amount?" She typed again, frowned slightly, then shook her head. "I would need to process it to confirm," she said. "It may be high." High. A soft word that can mean anything from inconvenient to impossible. I nodded as if I could handle high because I've handled high before in different forms. High bills, high stress, high grief, and I refused to let my face show that my first thought wasn't the price, but the insult of it. Being forced to pay for someone else's cruelty. I asked for a supervisor without making it sound like a threat. "May I speak with someone who can advise me on what to do when a passenger is left without a phone?" I said, not accusing, just stating. The staff member's shoulders lifted slightly in a breath that looked like she'd had a long day already. "One moment," she said, and she tapped something on her screen. While she did, I noticed how my surroundings kept moving like my situation didn't exist. A couple rolled their luggage past, laughing softly at something on a phone. A child ran a few steps ahead of his parents until his mother caught his sleeve. A man in a suit adjusted his watch and checked the board without stopping. Everybody had somewhere to go and somebody to call. I had neither. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, and the ache in my cheek pulsed again, a private metronome reminding me I was still carrying that earlier moment in my body, even if nobody else could see it. The staff member lifted her eyes. "The supervisor is assisting another passenger," she said. "It may take some time." I didn't argue. "I can wait," I said, because that was the only power I had left in that moment, my composure. She printed a small slip of paper, the kind they hand you when they want you to feel like something is happening, and slid it across the counter. "Please have a seat, madam," she said, voice gentle but firm. "We will check something and call you when we have an update." I stared at the paper in my hand for half a second too long because I knew what that sentence usually meant in real life. Sit down, disappear, and let time do what people are too uncomfortable to do themselves. Then I nodded once, folded the slip carefully like it mattered, and walked back toward the seating area to wait while they checked something. Time doesn't pass in an airport the way it passes anywhere else. It doesn't feel like minutes. It feels like you're being held in place while other people keep proving they're allowed to move. I sat where the staff member told me to sit, slip of paper folded neatly in my hand like it was a promise. And I watched the counter from a distance the way you watch a door you're not sure will open for you again. Every few minutes, someone new stepped up, spoke, smiled, slid a passport across, and walked away with certainty. I stayed seated, trying to keep my breathing even, trying to keep my face calm, because the longer you wait without being called, the easier it becomes for the world to pretend you were never there. My cheek had cooled, but it still felt tender underneath, as if the skin was holding a bruise that hadn't declared itself yet. I pressed my tongue against the inside of my mouth once, grounding myself in something physical so I wouldn't drift into that thin, humiliating panic where you start imagining your son's voice as if he might come back. He didn't. I could have told myself 100 excuses for him: stress, confusion, a wife he was trying to protect, but my body wouldn't accept them. My body knew abandonment when it felt it. A soft chime sounded overhead and a flight was called. People rose in little waves, gathering their things, checking phones, calling names. I sat still with my bag close, listening to the rolling sound of wheels on tile and the low murmur of goodbyes. The staff member's eyes flicked toward me once, then away, and that small act, looking away, felt like its own kind of answer. When the slip of paper began to feel ridiculous in my hand, I stood. Not abruptly, not angrily. I stood the way a woman stands when she has decided she will not be trained into silence by a waiting room. I walked back to the counter and waited until the staff member finished with the person in front of me. She looked up and I saw it in her face before she spoke. She didn't have anything new. "Madam," she said, polite again, measured again. I placed my slip of paper on the counter. "You said you would call me," I replied, voice low. "It's been some time." She glanced at the paper, then at her screen. Her fingers moved across the keyboard like they were performing the part of the job that made people feel heard. Then she gave me the same answer dressed in slightly different words. "We are still checking," she said. "The cancellation was requested by the person who booked the ticket." I nodded once, because nodding kept me from saying what I wanted to say, which was that this wasn't a cancellation. It was a decision made over my life while I was still standing in it. "I understand that," I said. "I'm asking what you can do for the passenger who was left behind without her phone." The staff member's mouth tightened slightly, not with cruelty, with caution. She leaned forward a fraction and lowered her voice, which told me she was choosing her words carefully. "Madam," she said, "your son booked everything." She said it like a wall, like a boundary I shouldn't try to climb, like it explained why the system wouldn't stretch for me. And that sentence did something to my chest, because hearing it out loud again, in a public space, made the abandonment feel official. Not emotional, not personal, official. My throat tightened, and I took a slow breath in through my nose so my voice wouldn't shake. I was about to ask for the supervisor again when I felt it. Someone's gaze. Not the quick glance people give when they hear tension. Something steadier. I didn't look right away. I kept my eyes on the counter because looking around too fast would have made me look lost, and I wasn't going to look lost. The staff member turned her screen slightly away as if to end the conversation, and I stepped back with my slip of paper still on the counter, refusing to snatch it like a child being dismissed. That was when I heard a man's voice behind me, low and clipped, on a phone call that sounded like it mattered. Not loud enough to be rude, but firm enough that people moved around it. "No," he said. "I'll handle it when I get there." His tone wasn't angry, it was decisive. The kind of voice that didn't ask permission to exist. I turned my head just slightly, and I saw him a few steps away near the edge of a seating section, phone at his ear, suit jacket open, shoulders relaxed like time worked for him. He ended the call without drama, slipped the phone into his pocket, and for a brief moment his eyes lifted and met mine. The jolt that went through me wasn't fear. It was memory. A face I hadn't seen in decades, but my mind recognized the shape of it instantly, the way you recognize a song from one note even if you can't name it. Not from money, not from status, not from any formal space, from far back, from school years, from hallways and summer heat, and a boy who used to look at me like he saw more than my surface. My fingers curled around the edge of my bag strap. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply looked at me again, longer this time, as if he was making sure his memory wasn't lying. I looked away first, not because I was afraid of him, but because looking too long at a memory can make it start talking back to you. My mind wanted to run ahead, names, years, places, but I kept it on a short leash because right now wasn't the time to drift into the past. Right now, I was standing in an airport with no phone and no ticket, and the last thing I needed was nostalgia making me soft. Still, I felt him there, the way you feel a person's attention when it isn't casual. I turned back toward the counter, picked up my slip of paper, and folded it again with slow precision, like the act itself could hold me together. The staff member had already shifted her body to face the next passenger, a polite dismissal that didn't require her to say goodbye. I stepped away from the desk, not defeated, just repositioning, and I chose a spot a few feet off to the side where I could breathe without being jostled. My heart was steady but heavy, the kind of heaviness that comes when you realize you are alone in a foreign place and your own child has decided that's acceptable. I kept my chin lifted because dignity is sometimes the only thing you can control. Behind me, the man didn't move right away. I could hear the hum of the terminal, the soft drag of rolling luggage, the announcement sliding overhead in that calm voice that never changes. I watched a woman hand over her passport and smile at the staff member like she trusted the world. I watched a couple hug quickly near a pillar, the kind of hug that says, "I'll see you soon." My stomach tightened at the sight, because my last hug had been the night before in a hotel hallway where Nathaniel had barely looked at me, and I'd told myself he was tired. People always tell themselves something when they don't want to face the truth. The truth was standing in my chest now, refusing to be ignored. I heard footsteps, not rushing, not creeping, just a measured approach. I didn't turn immediately. I waited until the sound stopped within my space, close enough that if I shifted, I would have to acknowledge him. My skin prickled slightly, not fear, awareness. When I finally turned my head, he was there, a few feet away, not smiling, not performing, just watching me with a calm expression that made me feel like he was seeing more than my posture. His eyes flicked briefly to my cheek, and I felt exposed in a way I didn't like. I adjusted my face, smoothing it into something neutral. He didn't speak. He didn't ask if I was okay, and oddly, that restraint made him feel safer, not colder. People who rush in with sympathy often want something in return, a story, a confession, a weakness they can carry away. He offered none of that. He simply stood and watched how the staff moved around me like I was furniture. I shifted my weight and walked toward a different counter line, trying again without making it obvious that I was trying again. A different staff member was there now, younger, eyes, already tired. I explained the situation in the same calm tone, because calm was my shield. The staff member typed, paused, and then said the same thing, almost word for word, like the system itself had one script for women like me. "The booking was canceled by the account holder," she said. Her eyes lifted briefly, then lowered again. "Your son booked everything." There it was again. Your son, spoken like a verdict. My throat tightened and I felt heat rise behind my eyes. Not tears yet, just the pressure of them waiting. I blinked slowly and nodded as if I'd expected it, because if I looked shocked, I'd look foolish. I stepped back from the counter and took one breath in through my nose, one breath out through my mouth, the way I used to do when Nathaniel was little and his tantrums tried to pull me into chaos. I realized with a bitter quiet that I had been practicing for this kind of moment my whole life, learning how to keep myself steady while other people acted out. The man's presence shifted closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to place him in my peripheral vision. His gaze stayed on the staff member for a second, then on me. I could feel the question hanging in the air without him asking it. "Are you going to keep taking this?" My pride bristled because I didn't want to be rescued. I didn't want to be pitied. I wanted my son to turn around and undo what he'd done. But that wasn't happening, and the longer I stood here alone, the more I understood that waiting for Nathaniel to suddenly become the man I raised was another form of begging. The man took one more step, and this time our eyes met fully. No smile, no softness, just that strange, sharp recognition that makes your heart remember before your mouth does. His jaw moved slightly, like he was about to speak, then he stopped himself. He looked past me toward the counter, then back at me as if he was weighing something. And without a word, he stepped closer into my space, close enough that if he chose to speak, only I would hear. He didn't rush me. That was the first thing that told me he wasn't dangerous. Men with bad intentions hurry you, crowd you, force urgency before you've agreed to anything. He did the opposite. He stood beside me like he'd been there the whole time, a quiet presence that didn't demand my attention but made the space around us change. I could feel the staff member's eyes flick toward him and then back to her screen. The kind of glance people make when they suddenly realize this is no longer an easy dismissal. He didn't speak to her yet. He didn't speak to me either. He simply placed his body in the line of sight, not blocking, just existing with a steadiness that didn't ask permission. I hated that it worked. I hated that in this world I could stand there alone and be treated like a nuisance, but the moment a man in a suit stood next to me, the air shifted slightly, as if my dignity had been upgraded by association. I kept my face neutral, but inside I felt a sharp, private anger, not at him, but at the way systems decide who matters. The staff member asked, "Next," and I stepped forward again because I refused to shrink away. I held my passport in my hand like a witness. "My ticket was canceled," I said, calm, precise. "I was left without my phone." The staff member typed, paused, and then began her sentence the way she always did, like she was reading from a file. "Madam, the booking was—" She stopped when the man shifted slightly, not interrupting, just making his presence impossible to ignore. She finished anyway. "Canceled by the person who booked it. Your son booked everything." Hearing it again made my throat tighten, but I didn't let it show. I nodded once as if I'd heard worse, because I had. I turned my head slightly and looked at him properly for the first time. The memory in my mind was still vague. Hallways, laughter, a boy's face. But the man in front of me was older now, composed, carrying himself like he had somewhere important to be. His eyes met mine with a steadiness that said he recognized the girl I used to be, even if he couldn't name her out loud. My fingers tightened around my passport. I wanted to ask his name. I wanted to say, "I know you." But my pride held my tongue. In a moment like this, asking for help feels like confessing weakness, and I had been swallowing weakness for hours. He didn't ask me for permission to speak. He didn't ask me for my story. He leaned slightly, not close enough to touch, just close enough that his voice could reach only me. "Say you're with me," he whispered. His words weren't dramatic. They were flat, urgent, practical. I blinked once, trying to place the meaning before the fear. He added quietly, "Please, my driver is almost here." The way he said driver, not taxi, not ride, made something in my mind pause, but I didn't chase it. It wasn't the time to wonder who he'd become. It was the time to decide whether I could trust who he used to be. My pulse jumped. Every warning my mother ever planted in me rose up at once. Don't follow strangers, don't pretend, don't put yourself in a situation you can't explain later. But he wasn't a stranger. That was the problem. The familiarity sat in my chest, like a locked drawer I didn't have the key for, and yet my body recognized it. His face didn't carry hunger. It carried annoyance, not at me, at the situation, at the disrespect. He wasn't looking at me like a woman to take advantage of. He was looking at me like a person who shouldn't be treated this way. I stared at him for 1 second longer than was safe, searching his eyes for something that would tip the scale. He didn't blink. He didn't soften. He waited. That patience did something to me. It reminded me of the way some people used to wait for me to speak back in school, like my voice mattered even when I didn't. Use it often. My throat moved as I swallowed. I nodded once. Small. Final. The staff member's eyes moved between us, and I watched her posture shift subtly, shoulders lifting, attention sharpening. The man straightened and stepped half a pace forward, not pushing me behind him, not shielding me like property, just standing so we looked like a unit. He spoke to the staff member with the same calm tone she'd been using on me, but with one difference. He sounded like time was valuable. "We're together," he said simply. No explanation, no performance, just a statement placed down like a card. The staff member's expression changed. Not friendliness, professional alertness. She glanced toward the supervisor's area and then back at us. I felt my stomach twist with a mix of relief and shame because the shift proved what I'd already known. Alone, I was easy to ignore. With him, I was suddenly worth addressing. The man tilted his head slightly toward me, just enough to indicate the next step without speaking it. I adjusted my grip on my bag, lifted my chin, and moved when he moved, following his lead like we'd done it before. Like my body understood the rhythm, even if my mind still wanted to resist it. The change wasn't dramatic. That's what made it sting. No one suddenly bowed. No one apologized. The world didn't stop to acknowledge what it had just done to me. The shift came in tiny movements, the kind you only notice when you've spent hours being dismissed. The staff member's shoulders straightened. Her eyes stayed on us longer. Her voice softened by half a degree, not warmer, just more careful, like she had decided her words needed to be clean now. "Please step this way," she said, and instead of gesturing vaguely toward the end of the counter line like I was being sent away again, she motioned toward a quieter side area near a small standing desk. The man beside me moved without urgency, and I followed because my body had already accepted that his calm was the only solid thing in this moment. I hated how natural it felt to walk in step with someone I hadn't spoken to in decades, but the familiarity wasn't in conversation. It was in the way he carried himself, the way he made space without forcing it, the way he didn't treat me like a fragile emergency. He didn't ask me to explain myself. He didn't ask what happened between me and my son. He simply stayed near, letting the system see me as attached to something it respected. The staff member offered chairs as if they had just appeared, 2 cushioned seats near a small table. "Please sit," she said, and when I hesitated, used to being told to wait in the corner like a forgotten file, she added, "We will assist you here." The words were the same kind of promise they'd given me earlier, but now they were wrapped in attention. I sat carefully, smoothing my skirt, placing my bag on my lap again like a habit I couldn't break. The man sat beside me. Without leaning too close, his knees angled slightly away, giving me room to breathe. A bottle of water appeared on the table with no fuss. I watched it set down like it was proof that comfort had always been available, just not offered to people like me when I stood alone. My throat tightened and I swallowed the bitterness. I took the bottle anyway. The cold plastic against my fingers grounded me, and when I drank, the water tasted like nothing, clean, empty, but it helped my mouth stop feeling so dry. The staff member stepped away to make calls, and I listened to the softened rhythm of her voice as she spoke to someone out of sight. The man's presence held steady beside me, silent but not distant. I tried to place him again, not the boy I remembered, but the man he was now. His hands rested lightly on his thighs, no nervous tapping, no fidgeting. His watch caught the light when he shifted his wrist, and I noticed the small signs of a life lived with control. Shoes polished, nails clean, a scent of something expensive but not loud. Still, he didn't perform wealth. He performed certainty. That certainty disturbed me almost as much as it relieved me, because it showed me how easily the world could be moved when you knew where to press. A few minutes passed, and then a supervisor approached. An older woman in a tailored uniform, her face composed in the way people learn when they manage problems for a living. She looked at the man first, then at me, then back to the staff member. "Good afternoon," she said, voice smooth. "How may we assist?" The man did not answer for me. He turned his head slightly toward me, giving me the opening to speak without feeling like I was begging. I straightened my shoulders and kept my voice calm. "My return ticket was canceled by the person who booked it," I said. "I have no phone with me." I left my son's name out of it because I wasn't ready to give him power inside my mouth. The supervisor nodded slowly, eyes flicking briefly to the passport in my hand. "We can review your options," she said, and even that sentence sounded different now, less like a dismissal, more like a process. The staff member returned with a printed page and held it out with both hands. The supervisor scanned it quickly, then looked at the man again, as if checking whether he expected more. He didn't demand, he didn't threaten. He simply said in a quiet voice, "We need a solution that gets her out of this situation today." "We." That word landed in my chest with a complicated weight. I hadn't been anyone's we in hours. The supervisor nodded again. "Understood," she said, and she gestured toward the chairs as if to confirm that we could remain there while it was handled. Still no apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened, only repositioning. It was like watching a machine adjust its gears once it realized a different kind of eye was on it. I looked down at my hands and saw how tightly my fingers had been gripping my passport, knuckles pale. I loosened my grip slowly, forcing my body to unclench. The man's phone vibrated on the table, a low buzz that cut through the quiet like a blade. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time since he'd stepped into my space, his expression shifted, just slightly, into urgency. He answered without standing, keeping his voice low. "Yes," he said. "I see you. Give me 2 minutes." He ended the call and looked at me, and something in his eyes said time had just become smaller. "My driver is here," he murmured, not dramatic, just factual, and the supervisor straightened as if that sentence carried more weight than any of mine had all day. The word driver should not have meant anything to me, but it did. It shifted the air again, not because I suddenly cared about who he was, but because I could see how quickly other people cared. The supervisor's attention sharpened. The staff member straightened as if she'd been reminded to stay professional in a different way. I watched it happen and felt the old, bitter lesson settle in my chest. The world is kinder when it thinks someone important is watching. The man rose from his chair without rushing, sliding his phone back into his pocket, and he looked down at me as if asking with his eyes whether I was ready to move. I stood slowly because my dignity needed to arrive before my body did. The supervisor spoke in that smooth tone again, offering a sentence that sounded helpful but didn't commit to anything. "We can continue to review the options here, madam," she said. The man didn't contradict her. He simply turned slightly so his body created a quiet path away from the counter area, not dragging me, not directing me like a child, just guiding with presence. We moved a few steps to a calmer stretch of floor near a pillar where the noise softened, where the crowds flowed around us instead of through us. For the first time since he'd whispered to me, we were alone enough that silence could become personal. I kept my gaze forward because if I looked at him too directly, the memory might fully unlock, and I wasn't ready to feel anything tender. He spoke softly, like he understood that my pride was bruised and didn't need to be handled roughly. "You can go home," he said, "or you can make sure this doesn't get rewritten later." The way he said rewritten made my stomach twist, because that was exactly what Yvette had done. Rewritten the moment before Nathaniel ever looked at me properly. I held my bag tighter, feeling the strap dig into my palm. "What are you talking about?" I asked, and my voice stayed calm, but there was a sharp edge under it now. The edge of a woman who has realized she has been played in front of her own child. He didn't answer with drama. He answered like a man who had seen enough of life to know that the smallest cruelty becomes a habit if nobody records it. "Do you want to go? Home," he repeated. "Or do you want the truth fixed?" The phrase truth fixed made me bristle. It sounded like a bribe, like a favor, like something that would come back to haunt me. I shifted my weight slightly away from him, not stepping back, but protecting my space. "Fixed how?" I asked, careful because I wasn't going to trade one kind of vulnerability for another. He watched my face and I saw him register my suspicion without taking offense. That steadiness made him feel safer again. "Documented," he said. "Witnessed, logged, where it can't be twisted later." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't mention my son's name. He didn't call what happened abuse. He didn't tell me what I should feel. He spoke in plain, procedural words that sounded almost boring, and that was exactly why they scared me. Boring words become official words. Official words become consequences. I swallowed slowly, and the image of Nathaniel's back in the airport returned to me, not as a memory, but as a warning. If I let this fade, it would become the story Yvette told first. If I let this fade, the lie would harden into family truth, and I would be expected to accept it with a smile at the next holiday table. My throat tightened, and for a second I wanted to say, I don't want trouble. I don't want to embarrass him. But then my cheek pulsed under my skin, and I remembered how easily my son had accepted the version of me that made his wife look innocent. I turned my face slightly so he could see the bruise forming faintly near my cheekbone, the proof my body was creating without my permission. "And you can do that?" I asked quietly. He didn't boast. He didn't say, of course. He simply nodded once, like this was a matter of knowing how to move through systems, not forcing them. Then he added, softer, as if he knew I needed a human anchor more than a plan. "We've met before," he said. The sentence landed like a fingertip on a scar. My pulse jumped again, and the hallway in my mind flashed. School lockers, the smell of heat outside a classroom, a boy's laugh that used to carry toward me even when he wasn't speaking directly to me. I still couldn't name him out loud, and I hated that my body knew him better than my mouth did. He kept his eyes on mine without trying to soften the moment with a smile. "I know what happens," he said quietly, "when things like this are left to fade." The word fade hit me hard, because that's what women like me are taught to do. Fade the pain, fade the insult, fade the betrayal, until all that's left is silence and a forced peace that only protects the people who caused it. I inhaled slowly, feeling my spine straighten. I didn't thank him. I didn't ask for more explanation. I simply made a decision inside myself that felt like a door closing. And when he paused, waiting for my answer, I nodded once. Small, final, because I knew if I didn't nod now, I would spend the rest of my life explaining why I didn't. I didn't hear my son's first crack of regret through an apology. I heard it through the way other people began to touch the edges of his decision without asking permission. By the time the sun shifted in Dubai and the terminal's light turned a colder shade, the situation was no longer just family business. It had a timestamp, a record, a trail that didn't care about Yvette's tears or Nathaniel's pride. Leonard kept moving with that same quiet steadiness, never dragging me, never speaking over me, just positioning me where I could breathe and be handled as a person again. The staff stopped using that tired voice they'd used earlier, the one that made me feel like I was interrupting their day by existing. A supervisor returned with a calmer face and cleaner words, and I watched them treat my problem like a problem worth solving, not a nuisance worth delaying. Still, nothing felt fixed. Not inside me. Not in the part of my heart that kept seeing Nathaniel's back as he walked away. Leonard didn't try to soften that. He didn't tell me my son would come around. He didn't make it about forgiveness. He simply stayed close enough that the system kept behaving. When his phone buzzed again, he stepped a few feet away and spoke in a low voice I couldn't fully hear, and I didn't ask. I had already learned in one day that information is power, and I was done giving mine away too easily. We moved through the airport like a quiet unit, not a performance, just a fact. And the more I watched people respond to that fact, the more I understood what Leonard meant by things being logged where they couldn't be twisted later. Even my own pain felt less twistable when it was being treated as real. It wasn't until later, when I was seated in a calmer space, water in my hand, my bag still on my lap out of habit, that I began to feel the shock of the day catching up with my body. My fingers started to tremble faintly when I stopped concentrating. My cheek ached in deep pulses. My throat felt raw from holding words inside it. I could tell Leonard noticed because his gaze flicked to my hands once, then away, giving me privacy even in my weakness. Then his phone buzzed again, and this time when he answered, I heard the shift in his tone. Not alarm, not anger, just that clipped attentiveness people use when they're listening to something that confirms what they already suspected. He said, once. Then, yes, softer. Then he ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket as if he didn't want the screen to distract him from what was happening in front of him. "It's starting," he said quietly. 2 words, no drama. My stomach tightened. "What's starting?" I asked, and my voice surprised me with how steady it sounded, like something in me had already moved from hurt into watchfulness. Leonard didn't look pleased. He didn't look vengeful. He looked tired in a way that told me he'd seen this kind of thing before. Families swallowing wrong until it becomes normal. "They contacted him," he said. "The airline." He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like the natural consequence of a decision being placed into a system that keeps receipts. I stared at him, and for a second I wanted to say Nathaniel won't care, but my body wouldn't lie for him anymore. "Why would they contact him?" I asked anyway, because denial is a reflex, and I was still shaking it off. Leonard's eyes held mine. "Because the booking belongs to his account," he said. "Because a passenger was left without her phone. Because somebody noted it." He didn't add because somebody stood beside you. He didn't need to. The shame of that truth sat in my chest already. I swallowed slowly, picturing my son back home, picturing how he would tell the story when he walked through his front door. I could see it like a scene. Yvette's soft voice, Nathaniel's rigid shoulders, their suitcases in the hallway, the quiet relief of being back in their own space where they could pretend they were right. I could also see the moment that relief would be interrupted, his phone buzzing with a number he didn't recognize, someone's professional voice asking calm questions that didn't match the story he'd been holding. Leonard didn't have to describe it. I could feel it. The lie always survives when it stays inside the house. The lie starts to crack when it meets daylight. "He'll say he was protecting his wife," I murmured, and the bitterness in my own voice startled me. Leonard didn't argue. He just nodded once, as if he knew that protection is often the excuse people use when they're too ashamed to admit fear. Then, after a beat, he added quietly, "He's already being asked for details he didn't think anyone would ask." That sentence made my skin go cold because details are where lies bleed. Yvette could cry her way through feelings. She couldn't cry her way through timestamps. Leonard's phone buzzed again, and this time he didn't answer right away. He looked at me first, as if giving me the dignity of being prepared. Then he answered, listened, and his jaw tightened slightly. When he ended the call, he said, almost under his breath, "He's home now." My pulse jumped. "Nathaniel?" Leonard nodded. "And he's asking questions." I could see it. My son turning toward his wife, the first flicker of doubt forcing its way past his loyalty, his voice lower than usual, his face tightened with something he didn't want to name. Leonard didn't dramatize it. He didn't smile. He just said the next part like a door clicking shut. He just asked her again what really happened. I wasn't there when my son asked her again what really happened, but I could see it anyway because I've known Nathaniel's silences since he was a boy. He never exploded first. He went quiet first. Quiet meant he was measuring. Quiet meant he was trying to decide whether to protect someone or protect the truth. Leonard told me just enough to keep me anchored in reality without turning my pain into entertainment. "He's not yelling," he said after another short call. "He's asking the same question twice." That alone was a shift in power. Men who believe a story don't ask it twice. I sat with my hands folded over my bag, listening to the airport's steady hum, and I felt something strange settle into me, an unfamiliar calm. Not peace, control. The kind that comes when you stop trying to convince people to love you correctly and start watching what they do when consequences arrive. Leonard didn't push conversation. He didn't try to comfort me with soft talk. He just stayed close, phone in hand, as if he was holding a line open between what happened to me and what was happening to them. When the update came, it came the way truth often comes, through small details shifting, not grand confessions. Leonard's phone buzzed. He listened, and his eyes narrowed slightly. When he ended the call, he didn't tell me Yvette admitted anything. He said, "She changed it." My stomach tightened. "Changed what?" I asked. Leonard's mouth pressed into a line, not disapproval, observation. "The order," he said, "the words." That was enough to make my throat go dry because order and words are where people reveal themselves when they're lying. A person telling the truth can repeat the same moment the same way without thinking. A person adjusting a lie has to keep editing the script. I pictured my son standing in their home, suitcase wheels still dirty from travel, the air smelling like airplane fabric and perfume, Yvette moving around the kitchen too quickly, her hands doing little tasks that didn't need doing, straightening a towel, wiping a clean counter, because nervousness needs somewhere to go. I could hear Nathaniel's voice in my head, low, restrained. "Tell me again," he would say, not accusing, just insisting. And Yvette would smile faintly, a controlled smile that says you're being unreasonable for doubting me. "I already told you," she'd say, and I could imagine her tone, soft, wounded, patient, the tone women use when they want a man to feel guilty for wanting clarity. Leonard's next update came after a pause, and it landed like a small crack in glass. "She added a line," he said. "What line?" I asked, and I hated how steady my voice sounded, like I was collecting evidence instead of surviving heartbreak. Leonard looked at me briefly, then away, as if he didn't want to enjoy telling me this. "She said you lunged at her," he replied. My chest tightened hard. Lunged. That word was carefully chosen. It makes a person sound out of control without requiring proof. It gives a slap the shape of self-defense. It gives my son a reason to feel like a protector instead of a man who abandoned his mother. My fingers curled around the strap of my bag. I didn't cry. Crying would have been easy. What I felt was something colder, sharper, disgust at how smoothly she could reshape me. Leonard continued, voice low. "At first she said you grabbed her wrist," he reminded me. "Now she's saying you stepped toward her fast." I closed my eyes for half a second and saw Yvette's face across that table. The way she'd looked at where Nathaniel went, the way she'd checked the distance before her hand moved. She hadn't acted in panic. She'd acted in calculation. And now, with my son's doubt creeping in, she was recalculating again, tightening the story around his conscience. Leonard's phone buzzed again almost immediately, and this time, when he listened, I watched the smallest change in his posture, his shoulders lifting slightly as if the conversation on the other end had shifted in tone. When he ended the call, he said, "She's calm." Calm meant she was still in control of herself. Calm meant she was still trying to keep Nathaniel from feeling like he had authority to question her. Calm meant she was trying to make his doubt look like betrayal. I imagined Nathaniel's face tightening, the muscle jumping near his temple like it had in the airport, his eyes dropping to the floor for a second because he didn't want to look at her and admit to himself that something didn't fit. I imagined him asking, "Why are you changing it?" And I imagined Yvette's response, the defensive calm that doesn't shout, doesn't confess, just redirects. "Why are you interrogating me?" she'd say. "After everything I went through?" She would make herself the injured one again. Leonard's voice stayed level when he gave me the next piece. "She's asking him why he's listening to strangers," he said. "Strangers?" I repeated, and the word tasted bitter because I knew exactly what she meant. Airline staff, policies, records, anyone outside the marriage who might force truth into daylight. Yvette would rather Nathaniel distrust the world than distrust her. I stared down at my hands and noticed how still they were. I wasn't shaking anymore. I was listening. Leonard's phone buzzed again, but he didn't pick it up right away. He looked at me first, and for the first time since he'd stepped into my life again, his expression softened, not into pity, into respect. "He's quiet now," he said. And I felt that silence through the distance like a wire pulled tight, because when Nathaniel goes quiet, it means he has finally reached the moment where he can't pretend the story makes sense, and he doesn't know what to do with what he's starting to see. I used to believe paper was cold. Numbers, forms, signatures, things that belong to banks and offices, not to mothers and families. But sitting in that airport with my son's silence growing louder across the ocean, I learned something I should have learned years ago. Paper is not cold. Paper is memory that cannot be argued with. Paper is what remains when someone tries to rewrite your face into a lie. Leonard didn't rush the process. He didn't storm up to counters like a man demanding respect. He moved with calm intention, speaking softly to staff, asking for the right person instead of the loudest person. And every time he did, I watched a system that had treated me like inconvenience begin to treat me like a case that needed to be handled carefully. The supervisor returned, not with warmth, but with attention. She held a folder and a few printed pages, and she spoke the way people speak when they know their words may be reviewed later. "Madam," she said, "we can document what occurred." The phrase "what occurred" made my stomach tighten because it sounded so small compared to how it felt, like they were describing a spill instead of abandonment. Still, I nodded once. Leonard glanced at me, a quiet question in his eyes. "Are you ready?" I surprised myself by answering without hesitation. "Yes," I said, one clean word. I didn't add emotion. Emotion can be questioned. I added consent. They guided us to a small desk area away from the busiest line, where the noise softened enough that I could hear my own breathing. The staff member set a pen down like it was a tool, not a weapon. She asked for my passport again, then asked for the booking reference. Leonard provided it without looking at me, sparing me the humiliation of not having it. The staff member typed, and the clicks sounded different now, less like delay, more like record. "Please describe what happened," she said to me, eyes steady, not curious, professional. I kept my shoulders square and my voice level. "My ticket was canceled by the account holder," I said. "I was left here without my phone." I stopped there. I didn't mention the slap yet. I didn't mention Yvette's words. I stayed inside the part that could be verified. The staff member nodded, eyes moving across her screen. "What time did you discover the cancellation?" she asked. Time. Specific. The kind of question lies struggle with. I gave her the approximate time based on the board and the check-in line. She asked what time I realized my phone was missing. I told her. I didn't accuse anyone of taking it. I stated the fact that it was not on me. Leonard stayed silent, letting my voice stand on its own, and that mattered more than I expected. He wasn't rescuing me from speaking. He was making sure I could speak and be taken seriously. The supervisor asked if I wanted to include a personal dispute as context, and I felt my throat tighten. Including it meant pulling the slap into a record. Excluding it meant letting Yvette keep the story clean. I touched my cheek lightly, feeling the faint swelling beneath the skin, and I made a choice that felt like stepping out of an old cage. "Yes," I said again. "There was an incident in the hotel dining area." I didn't call it assault. I didn't call it abuse. I described what could be understood without interpretation. I was struck by my daughter-in-law while my son was away. The staff member's eyes flicked up, then down. Her fingers slowed for a fraction, then continued typing. The supervisor's face stayed neutral, but her posture changed slightly like the stakes had shifted. "Was anyone else present?" the staff member asked. I thought of the room, the soft lighting, the way nobody's head turned fast enough. "There were other guests," I said, "but it was done quietly." Leonard spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice calm, almost gentle. "The staff can note the location and approximate time," he said. "If needed, they can confirm who was working that area." He didn't promise security footage. He didn't turn it into a spectacle. He suggested a path that sounded normal, and that was the power of it. It made my experience sound like something the world had procedures for. The staff member printed a page and slid it toward me. "Please review," she said. I read it slowly, line by line, and it felt strange seeing my humiliation reduced to neat sentences. but it also felt like protection. The story was no longer only in my mouth, where it could be dismissed as emotion. It was on paper now, where it could be compared to timelines and records and calls. I signed where she indicated, my name neat and steady, Lone Mavers. For a second, that signature felt like a promise to myself. The supervisor collected the pages, clipped them into a folder, and said, "We will attach this to the booking record and escalate it." Escalate. Another clean word that meant movement. She didn't tell me what would happen to my son. She didn't threaten him. She simply made the next step unavoidable. Leonard remained in the background of it all. His presence felt more like a brace than a spotlight. When we stood to leave the desk, the staff member added, almost as an afterthought, "A note will be added that there was independent corroboration of the passenger's situation." Independent corroboration. Not a name, not a badge. Just a phrase that meant the truth had been seen by someone outside the family. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need to. I understood it in my bones. Yvette's story was no longer the only story that existed. Leonard's phone buzzed again, and when he answered, his voice stayed low. "Yes," he said. "That's correct." He listened, then ended the call and looked at me. "They're contacting him officially," he said quietly, and the calm on his face made it feel even heavier, because calm meant it was real. The call came through. Leonard's phone, not mine, and that alone told me everything about how far Nathaniel had pushed me out of reach. Leonard looked at the screen first, eyes narrowing slightly. Then he angled the phone toward me without comment. I saw my son's name and felt an old reflex rise, my body wanting to answer immediately, wanting to smooth things over before they hardened. I stared at the screen until it vibrated again, and I made myself breathe. That reflex had served me for years. It had also trained my son to believe my forgiveness was automatic. I reached for the phone slowly, took it from Leonard's hand and held it in my palm like a weight I had finally decided to carry differently. When I put it to my ear, I didn't speak first. I let him fill the silence, because whoever speaks first is always the one trying to control the moment. "Mom," Nathaniel said, and his voice sounded thinner than I expected. Tight, restrained, not angry. There was a pause right after it, like he was waiting for me to rescue him with familiar softness. I didn't. "Nathaniel," I replied calmly. My own voice startled me with how steady it was. I heard him inhale, a short breath through his nose, like he was bracing himself. I didn't know they were going to call," he said. He didn't say airline. He didn't say complaint. He didn't say report. He said they the way people say it when consequences become faceless and official. I didn't know it would become this. I kept my eyes on the floor, listening for what mattered, not what sounded polite. "You didn't know you would be asked," I said, not accusing, just naming it. He went quiet for a beat, and I pictured his face, jaw tight, eyes focused on nothing, that look he gets when he's trying to find the least shameful way to admit something. "Mom," he said again, and this time his voice dropped lower, like he was afraid Yvette could hear through the walls. "Where are you?" The question sounded practical, but underneath it was fear. Not fear for me, fear of what this meant. I didn't answer right away because answering would give him a sense of control, and he had already used control on me once. "I'm safe," I said. 2 words, no details. Leonard didn't move beside me. He didn't lean in. He respected the boundary of my conversation, and that respect made me feel stronger. Nathaniel swallowed audibly. "I didn't leave you like that," he said quickly, like he needed to correct the story before it settled into truth. "I thought, you had your phone. I thought you could call. I thought..." His voice stumbled, and in that stumble I heard the real truth. He hadn't thought at all. He had reacted to Yvette's story and chosen the quickest way to prove loyalty. "You didn't check," I said quietly. My tone didn't rise. I didn't add judgment. I just placed the fact down between us. "I watched you walk away," I added, and the memory flashed in my chest again, sharp and humiliating, but I didn't let it drag my voice into tears. I saw you hesitate, then you left anyway. Nathaniel exhaled like that sentence hit him somewhere deep. Mom, please, he said, and the word please tasted strange coming from him. He hadn't said please when he told me to stay there at the airport. He hadn't said please when my ticket disappeared. Now he said it because the world was watching. I felt my throat tighten, not with pity, with disappointment so heavy it felt like grief. Are you calling to argue with me? I asked softly. He answered too fast. No, he said. No, I'm not. He stopped himself and lowered his voice even further. I'm calling because Yvette is saying things that don't make sense. That was the first real crack. Not regret for me. Doubt about her. That's how it always begins when a man has chosen the wrong side. Not with compassion, with confusion. She changed it, I said calmly. I know. He went quiet again. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear faint airport sounds around me through Leonard's space. Announcements, rolling wheels, distant voices. Nathaniel's voice returned rougher. Mom, did she hit you? The question came out like it hurt him to ask, because asking meant admitting the possibility that he had defended the person who harmed me. I didn't answer with a story. I answered with restraint. We will talk when I get home, I said, and my voice held a finality that surprised even me. Nathaniel made a sound in his throat, half frustration, half fear. When are you coming? He pressed. Soon, I said. Not because you're rushing me, because I'm ready to leave. Another pause. Then his voice softened in a way I recognized, not the softness he used for Yvette, but the one he used when he wanted to be a son again. Can I see you alone when you get back? The words were careful, almost ashamed, and I felt my pulse shift, because alone meant he was finally separating his thoughts from his wife's script. I stared ahead, phone pressed to my ear, and I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was I didn't know who I would be speaking to when he stood in front of me again. My son, or the man who abandoned his mother to prove a point. I came home without rushing, because rushing would have made it feel like I was running back into the same hands that pushed me away. Leonard arranged what needed to be arranged quietly, the way he'd done everything since he stepped beside me. No speeches, no boasting, no dramatic promises. When I stepped through the doors back on familiar ground, my body still carried Dubai inside it. The cold terminal air, the sting on my cheek, the long stretch of being unseen. Nathaniel was waiting, but not in a way that felt like he was in charge. He stood a little off to the side of the arrivals area, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the floor, until he saw me. Yvette was there too, but she didn't stand beside him this time. She kept a few steps back, arms folded, mouth set in that calm line she wore like armor. The distance between them told me something had already shifted before I even spoke. Nathaniel started forward, then stopped himself like he didn't know if he was allowed to come close. Mom, he said, and the words sounded small. I didn't answer with warmth. I answered with presence. I walked past him slightly, not ignoring him, just choosing where the conversation would happen, and he followed like a man trying to regain footing on ground he'd damaged. Leonard stayed back, near the edge of the crowd, not looming, not hovering, just existing as proof that I hadn't survived by accident. Nathaniel glanced at him once, then back at me, and the shame in his eyes deepened. Yvette cleared her throat softly, the kind of sound meant to pull attention back to her. This is being blown out of proportion, she said, voice controlled, polite enough to sound reasonable to strangers. I turned my head slowly toward her. My cheekbones still held a faint shadow of what happened, not a dramatic bruise, just enough to make the truth visible to anyone who looked without loyalty. Say it the same way you said it the first time, I replied quietly. My tone was even, but the words cut clean. Yvette's eyes flicked toward Nathaniel, searching for support the way she'd done in Dubai. He didn't move. He didn't step in. He didn't correct me. That silence was louder than any argument. I already told him, she said, and her calm was brittle now, cracking at the edges. You grabbed me, and she stopped, because she couldn't decide which version to commit to. Grabbed, lunged, raised voice. The edits were trapped in her throat. Nathaniel looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as his wife, but as a person capable of building a story out of convenience. Stop, he said, and his voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Yvette blinked, surprised, and I watched the moment she realized the room had shifted. Nathaniel, she began, softer now, leaning into wounded. You're going to take her side? He flinched at the word side because sides meant war, and he didn't want to admit he'd created one. I'm taking the truth, he said, and the sentence landed with a finality that made my throat tighten. He turned to me then, and for the first time since that dining table, he looked directly at my face, not past it, not around it. I canceled it, he said. No excuse, no but. I did it because I thought I was protecting my marriage, and I didn't stop to protect you. The honesty in that sentence hurt more than a lie, because it meant he had known what he was doing in some part of himself and did it anyway. He swallowed hard. And I left you there, he added, voice rougher now, without checking if you had your phone. Yvette's arms tightened around her body. You're acting like I made you do it, she snapped, and her mask slipped for the first time, revealing the anger underneath the polish. Nathaniel didn't turn toward her. That was the consequence beginning, not in court, not in drama, but in the quiet withdrawal of his loyalty. You lied, he said simply, and then, after a pause, and you watched me abandon my mother because of it. Yvette's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around as if searching for a way to make herself the victim again, but there were no strangers here to impress, no soft lighting to hide behind, no fresh audience to manipulate. There are going to be consequences, Nathaniel continued, and his voice steadied as he spoke, like he had finally found the spine he'd misplaced in Dubai. He didn't threaten her. He didn't shout. He said it like a man stating a decision he could no longer reverse. We're going to separate until this is addressed properly, and you will correct what you said formally, because my mother's name won't be carried like that. Yvette's face drained slowly. You can't be serious, she whispered, and for the first time she sounded afraid, not of me, of losing control. Nathaniel turned back to me, and his eyes filled with something that wasn't just regret. It was recognition of damage. I'm sorry, he said. Not the kind of sorry that wants it to go away, the kind that knows it won't. I nodded once, not forgiving, not rejecting, just accepting the reality that he had finally spoken like a man. Then I looked toward Leonard, intending to finally say what my pride had delayed all day, and I found he was already stepping back, easing out of the space like he had never wanted to be the center of it. Our eyes met briefly, recognition, old and steady, and he gave a small nod that felt like closure instead of possession. He didn't wait for praise. He didn't ask for gratitude. He helped in a way that closed the wound instead of reopening it. I watched him leave without fanfare, and something in my chest loosened, not because I owed him anything, and not because he expected it, but because his presence had reminded me of what quiet dignity looks like when it is backed by action. Nathaniel stood beside me, silent as Yvette's composure crumbled into the reality she couldn't talk her way out of anymore. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't perform pain. I simply held my posture and let the truth sit where it belonged. And when I finally spoke again, it was not for them. It was for myself. I didn't win anything that day, I said, my voice low and sure. I just stopped losing myself.